was warmer there. The suits are less dense, less warm, less constrictive, less military-like. So the most British-like garments you can possibly find from that era are the German ones, the urban German ones, or the upper-class German ones, because upper-class Germans will obviously belong to, like in Britain or France, they will obviously belong to the city, even if they had a country household. And the few ones that were always based in the country, they would most likely have dressed 80% of the time in purely urban styles of Germany, which also copied the British styles a lot. And on top of that, they had the same philosophy than in Britain, which was to copy the military styles a lot more than in France or Latin countries. And on top of that, they had a similar weather. So all to say that the suits are practically the same in terms of the wools, the yarn, how thick is the yarn used for the loom, for the loomed fabric, and what type of wools, and also the construction itself, so not just the sewing techniques, but especially how much padding they put and what type of padding they put, and how much of it they put. In other words, horse padding, especially for British coats, or wools, heavy wools, whereas in France there's more like thinner linens, and they would put less of it, so less interlinings, less padding, and softer wools, which thus created a more draping, way more breathable garment, way more adapted to French weather, and less military stuck-up like. So American styles for some reason are similar to French ones as soon as one is not into upper class. So from upper middle class downwards, even the northern part, it is very much inspired by French tailoring. It is like a modernized, or in a way factorized version of French tailoring. For example, the French invented the French buyer, I explained in my video I will post, and the British did not have that, because the British, they were always wearing waistcoat, they were more practical, they were always wear, and they would not think, we don't care about it looking super flat, because our wools are denser, so they will not start sagging down like the French wools, which are softer, so we do not need a French bias. So the Americans had a French bias because also their wools were more like the French ones, but they had a less complicated, more factory adapted, easier to produce, less good in this sense, but also easier to button small French bar that really is like that one. This is an old West American reproduction, and the French bar is small and comes from here. The original French bar from France was actually a whole piece and then a whole other piece there, and it does a better job, but never mind. The British and even the Germans, especially the British, would not have a French buyer. And so now for China and all, it becomes even more impossible to find originals, because only a tiny percentage of the population there has always been huge in ratio compared to the Western Europeans and all. I mean in China or Africa, but only a few people, especially in Africa, would actually dress like that, whether they be white or whatever. First of all, very few people would have been there. So a lot of local people, if they had more money and all, and were more modern, might wear that, or very similar styles. In Hong Kong especially, Hong Kong had a British tailoring tradition, because they started having British tailors coming there, I think starting in the late or very early late 18th or at least very early 19th century. So up until today, Hong Kong tailoring is some of the closest you will find to British tailoring. It is actually identical. So Hong Kong tailors constantly travel to Britain to learn. So when British tailoring, every time it evolves, they are aware of it, so they evolve at the same time. So if you go today to Hong Kong, it will not be British tailoring that initially was British in 1820, but evolved to a Hong Kongese tailoring. No, it evolves at the same time as the British tailoring. So the same situation was in 1890s. But only a few Hong Kong people, also because Hong Kong was a place of trade, so a lot of people from Western Europe, from all over the world would go there, and because Britain was the big boss of the world then, everyone wanted to copy Britain, so they would go to Hong Kong. They had these British tailors, or Hong Kong, or whatever, even Hungarian tailors that had purposefully learned the British way of tailoring, or at least really tried to emulate at least the styles and the main details, so that only subbers can actually tell the difference. But otherwise everything is pieced together the same, using the same types of interlining, and that's the reason for which. So But again, Hong Kong only produced, compared to the vast population, a small amount of that. And there were also travelers, businessmen traveling. So all of those travelers would have brought it back to their countries. If they came from Ukraine, they would bring it back to Ukraine. If they came from Mexico, they would have brought it back to Mexico. Had they come from where they had Chinese diplomat, they would have brought it back to China, so on and so forth. So you would not really find, and if you find a piece made in Hong Kong, except if it's like in Russia and you think, who could have done something so British in Russia? Probably it was then meant in Hong Kong by a Russian businessman traveling to Hong Kong, and a Hong Kong teller made it. But otherwise, if you find that piece in Britain, you will not be able to tell the difference with a British piece, because although it is much warmer and humid in Hong Kong, the whole point was really to copy as closest as possible the British clothing, so they would make it actually very uncomfortable for Hong Kong. They would make it houses very dense. They would actually import the fabric from Britain, so the same yarns, they would have it loomed in Britain, and then they would put the same interlinings, the same number of cloth. Like if it had 4 plies there, they would put 4 plies, so it would suffocate in Hong Kong, but it was really, for all intents and purposes, at least by 90% an identical British suit. Probably identical to Savile. It was actually Savile tailoring. So if you had a suit from Hong Kong then, it was closer to what you'd get in Savile to what you would have gotten from the north of England. Sounds funny, but it's true. So then that is really, I don't really know about Africa. I guess a similar situation occurred in Africa, but do not forget that until really a lot of the, especially what we call Central Africa, these very primitive, backward, poorest areas of Africa were not actually really discovered, or at least started being modernized before the 20th or even mid-20th or even later on, like 1970s and 1990s. So back then they were still living more or less like in antiquity, and the only modern people there were travelers that could not have modernized the whole place. So Africa stayed backward the longest, and that's the reason for which they are still the most backward today. And you can still find tribes living like in prehistoric times there. Whereas you can't really find that anywhere else in the world except Australia and New Zealand. And I think that is it. Like tribes being as old-fashioned as that. So, you have to realize, to recap, one has to realize, now that I have explained in details, the following. Very few people on Earth, very few, to get in details, very few continents. Okay, you want to dress 1890s, but when usually people say that, what do they mean the style of the Victorian era. Even if it is actually Spanish, I tell all the difference with it, you can't really tell the difference, but still, think of that. Only small parts of continents actually had people dressing like that. Obviously they had people dressing like that in Japan and China, but so few that they hardly count as a percent. It counts as like 0.1 or 0.0001%. So we can't really count those places, because obviously most of those tiny percentage of gardens being made then would not have survived through all the wars and all the stuff that happened since. So we will only concentrate on the places where there were a minimum common to see, even if only amongst certain more privileged classes, if that makes sense. So, only the following continents had clothing that to some extent had some classes wearing that similar clothing, and these were the European continent and the American continent, the whole American continent, including Brazil and everything. But now it subdivides. So in Europe, I'll start with Europe, because in Central Asia people do not dress like that, except no one dressed like that except maybe in Georgia, which technically is in Central Asia. People think Georgia is in Eastern Europe. No, it is in Central Asia. So I would pretend that Georgia is in Eastern Europe, just to make it simpler. So I said all of Europe, including Eastern Europe, including Georgia. Let's pretend it is part of Eastern Europe. But then, only in the western part do you actually get a majority of people that dressed like that. And then, even in the western parts, it still has to divide, because you have to sort of forget about the Scandinavians. So already all the northern westerns sort of forget about them because so few did it. And then, for the southern one,